The cloud. Okay, cool. All right, so you can see from our poll questions, first question was, when creating a trauma-informed system, it only involves a victim. So 97% answered false, 3% answered true. And then your understanding of trauma-informed care, very little, 16%, some knowledge, 72%, and then extensive knowledge, 13%. So that's kind of gives us a feeling for where we're starting from. So thank you very much for doing the poll. Okay, let me just take a picture. Cool, awesome. Now stop sharing. Okay, all right. So, and thank you for entering your information into the chat. I appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and get started. I think on our agenda, Lucinda, did you want to add anything else? No?
I just want to say thank you for attending our training session, and I appreciate everyone being here with us. And just to request to keep your microphone off. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, cool. All right, we'll get started with the training. Gwendolyn, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think, do you need to make me a co-host or something? So I can put slides up? Or...
I think Zoe's working on that. Yeah. Just give us a sec.
Sure. It's a really great turnout. You've got like 37 people.
That's great. I'm really glad everyone saw that on Facebook. So thank you for putting that up there.
Okay, it should work now.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen? I don't know why all these other things are popping up on my screen. I don't know if you saw them or not. Oh, you're closed captioning? Or did I do that?
I didn't turn it on, but that's kind of cool.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was kind of threw me there. But again, good morning, everyone. And it's good to be here with you today. As I'd mentioned earlier, my name is Gwendolyn Packard, and I'm a pre-VAWA survivor of domestic violence. And so I was in an abusive marriage for about 17 years and before the passage of VAWA. And so there weren't a lot of resources, and the shelters weren't very good back then. And anyway, that was kind of how I came to New Mexico, as I loaded up the kids, and I had a job here in New Mexico with the Pueblo of Pewaukee, and as tribal administrator. And so that was how I came to New Mexico, was really fleeing domestic violence. And as I'd mentioned earlier, that was quite a few years ago. And you know, I never thought I would be doing this work, but it's really kind of a calling to do this work. And so, and it seems like the longer you do it and the more you're involved in it, it really, you know, consumes your whole life and your whole way of thinking. And that's a really good thing, I think. So it's a really healthy thing. So we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to say a little bit about, oh, and I'm doing the slides, never mind. I just wanted to say a little bit about the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center that I've been working with since our beginning. We're 10 years old now, and we're dedicated to reclaiming the sovereignty and safety of Native women. And we're a National Indian Resource Center funded by the Family Violence Prevention Services Administration, the FIPSA office. And we serve Indian nations, Alaska Native villages, Native Hawaiians, and tribal communities. And our mission is to provide national leadership to end violence against Native women by supporting culturally grounded grassroots advocacy. So I'm really happy again to be here with you all today. Just this past January, NIWRC has a new project called the STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center. And so I transitioned over into that space beginning January. And, doing the work, doing the domestic violence work, housing was always the number one issue. And we know that's the reason a lot of women stay. And oftentimes women who do flee, the streets are sometimes their only viable option for safety. And so it's, we want to take on all those things as we do our work. Our vision is safe housing for all our relatives. And we advocate for safe housing and doing this work through centering Indigenous lifeways and acknowledging our relationship to Earth Mother, taking into consideration the impact of climate change on our lifeways and our moving forward, and housing, tremendous impacts on housing with the climate change that we see happening. Building on each other's gifts, we believe that everyone has a gift to offer, resisting oppression and erasure, and acting upon the prayers of our ancestors to honor diversity and create belonging for us all. So STAR stands for Safety, Training, Technical Assistance, Resources, and Support. What do we mean by trauma? And this is always a big one. I know there's a chat box that's probably a lot of you, I don't know if I can get it on here. Maybe I can't. Okay, there it is. So what do we mean by trauma? Is always the question I like to open with. And I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm trying to click this thing off. There. Okay. And if some of you would like to put something in chat while I'm going through some of these slides, that's great. If you have any questions, if you want to raise your hand, or I think you can just unmute and speak up along the way if there's something that you want to stop and talk about, or something you'd like to stop and share. Please let me know. I'm happy to do that. So what I would say about trauma is that everyone experiences trauma at some point in their life. Throughout our lives, we'll experience many types of trauma. And trauma is so unique to the individual. No two people have the same experience. 5 of us could have the same traumatic experience, and we're all going to be impacted differently by that. Some of us won't have any impact, just kind of blow over. Some of us will be deeply impacted, and that can be long lasting. Some of us may have some little problems or issues around the trauma that we experienced. And so it's all different levels. We experience it in many, many different ways. And our individual experience, we perceive this as a threat to life or to our psychic or bodily integrity. It's a huge threat to who we are as individuals, as human beings. And our coping capacities, or our abilities to integrate our emotional experiences, are overwhelmed. Sometimes trauma just kind of stops you in your tracks. You can't really think or move forward. And we know this is true for people who experience domestic violence, where the trauma is pervasive and ongoing. And so a lot of times, if you're working with victim survivors of domestic violence, sometimes they're unable to remember the story or to remember it accurately, because there's a block there with remembering. And a lot of times people in programs will think that, they're being uncooperative or whatever, but really it's understanding their trauma, what experience they're going through. And it gives you greater insight into working with them and understanding the impact of trauma on individuals. And of course, as Indigenous people, cultural and historical trauma can impact individuals and communities across generations. And even though we don't think we're impacted by the trauma that our ancestors experienced, we're deeply affected by that. Again, some of us to a large extent, and others of us may not be as impacted. And so, again, that still runs in our blood and it runs in our veins, and we carry that with us. And as I'll get further into the presentation, I'll talk about how healing can change all of that. And understanding trauma is a big part of that. So talking about historical trauma that I just mentioned, it's a collective trauma that's been suffered by a group of people because of historical events that were destructive to the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual way of life. Historical trauma, when the term first became coined, probably back in the 60s. At that time, it didn't include spiritual, but as we've done this work in trauma, we've added that because we know that's significant in working with Indigenous people. And it's also called a soul wounding. Historical trauma can be described as a soul wounding or a spiritual wounding, because it affects every bit of us. It affects us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Over our lifespan and across generations, we unknowingly pass down our impact from historical trauma to our children and to our children's children until we can understand it and heal from it. And the collective traumas of colonization, I say they affect, I would say 100% of all of us are impacted by the colonization and the trauma that our ancestors experienced. And it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And to me, as I've come to look at it, one of the most harmful ways has been the internalized oppression, a symptom, which is, what we see so often in our communities and in our families and with our people, is really our inability to support one another, to be happy for one another, to love one another, to be kind to one another. It really, internalized oppression is really devastating because of the jealousy and the violence and everything that comes with that. And so I always think that's probably one of the worst impacts of historical trauma. And then we know that the historical context of trauma began with contact. And we saw the genocide of our people in so many different ways. And it was different in different parts of the country. I'm from the Northern Plains area. And for us, our colonizers were the French primarily. And we were kind of left alone up until the mid 1800s. And so it's really just been like a century and a half of our contact and all the things that have happened during that time. The Wounded Knee, of course, and just the taking of our land and water and resources, the forced removal onto reservations, the boarding schools, having our children removed without our knowledge, sterilization by the Indian Health Service, and of course, changing federal policies. We went through a lot of different eras as Indigenous people, from termination to self-determination, really. Every time the federal policies change, and they're getting ready to change again. The whole Roe v. Wade, and then also a lot of the legislation around Indian child welfare and other things that are coming before the Supreme Court in the fall or this coming year. All of those will change how we are in our communities, the health of our communities, the protection of our children, and so forth. So we're deeply impacted by that. And of course, the reservations, their reservations can be sometimes, and it depends. There are really good places where they've done a lot of work on addressing the violence in their communities and addressing the trauma. And I always like to point out the Mohawk tribe in upstate New York. They've spent 30 years addressing historical trauma And during that time, all their tribal programs have become trauma informed. So their law enforcement is trauma informed. Their courts are trauma informed. Their child welfare programs are trauma informed. And so if you'd be interested in having, a meetup with them or connecting on some of that, I'm happy to help make that happen too, because I think it's really important when communities come together and talk about this. And sometimes I know communities get so overwhelmed by the violence that's going on, the violence they're experiencing. Poverty is a form of violence. And so when you look at homelessness and all these other things, housing insecurity, when you look at all of that, there's layers of trauma that we're dealing with. And so sometimes it's just peeling those back as best we can. And we know that the whole missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, that's getting a lot of attention now. And thank God it's getting the attention that it's getting, and hopefully something will change from all of this. And this will end. But all of that are direct results of our historical trauma and the worldview of who we are as Indigenous people. So the historical trauma response, and you see this in a lot of tribes. Again, I don't like to generalize, but it's really hard to do when there's like 574 federally recognized tribes. And so we're very multicultural people. We're not monolithic at all. And so it's very, very different. And but we see that some of the response that we see in our communities are high numbers of child abuse and neglect. And oftentimes we're breaking that down too, because within those numbers and that data, oftentimes there's factors to consider that may be genocidal. Why are our children being removed? We just had it's just something I just became aware of recently. They were talking about shelter and housing. They're saying, well, no one stays in shelter, so we're not going to build any more shelters. But rather than asking, why aren't people staying in shelter? Why don't people want to go to shelter? Just really looking at things differently. And when we're confronted with data like high rates of child abuse and neglect, racism, bloodism, who's Indian, who's not Indian, who's more Indian than you are, those kinds of things, all there, all present. The lateral violence and bullying. I grew up on several of the I grew up in Rosebud and several of the Lakota reservations, and it was really violent growing up, is getting beat up after school and stuff like that. And from what I understand, not a whole lot of that has changed. We know that, mental health impacts are tremendous, because a lot of things that go unresolved for years, like depression, if there's no treatment, or if someone's not helping you deal with your mental health issues, it's very rare that they'll get better on their own. I'm not going to say that they won't, but it's very rare that they would get better on their own. And we know that for so many of us, there's a real lack of resources when it comes to mental health, counselors or support. And the same with physical illness. During COVID, the clinic here closed down. So people with chronic diseases didn't really have a place to go. No one's monitoring and checking on them. We won't know for probably several more years the total impact of COVID on our people. Sexual abuse, a lot of this directly from boarding schools, from churches. There's a lot of ways that our children and our relatives have been sexually exploited and abused. Suicide, we have some of the highest rates of suicide. There again's another one. And it's just tragic when you learn of a 8 or 9-year-old girl who's decided that she doesn't want to live anymore and she takes her life. It's like, it's just overwhelming that, what we're dealing with in so many places, and disconnects from the education system. A lot of studies have been done on this, and they show that, a lot of Indian people get their doctorates and their advanced degrees later on in life, rather than, you know, straight on through. But there is those disconnects throughout, you know, spaces in between. And of course, family violence, you know, the elder abuse, sibling abuse, you know, gangs, families, those kinds of things in our communities are taking place. And I think probably the biggest one is the violence against Indigenous women. And so here, you know, when I mentioned internalized oppression earlier, these are some of the effects of internalized oppression, is that, you know, it erodes self-esteem. You know, it's not uncommon for growing up on the res for people to really bring you down, like, what are you doing all dressed up? You know, who do you think you are? You know, it's really, really difficult for people to get out of that and to change and to heal and, you know, to love and support one another. Those things are very, very difficult. It disempowers, you know, you don't feel like you can do anything. You feel like you're nobody, you're nothing. It depletes trusting relationships. You don't know who to trust. You don't even know if you can trust yourself. It fuels depression. It enhances isolation. You know, if you don't feel there's anyone you can talk to, you're isolating yourself. And it reduces our strategies to overcome and heal. We're not unable to reach out for help, or don't even know where or how to reach out for help. And all of that results in a heightened sense of hopelessness. And it just goes on to perpetuate conflict in the community and contribute to the traumatic experience unless it is stopped. And so we'll talk about some of those strategies as we go forward here. And Lucinda, if you see anything in chat, you can just bring my attention to it. Okay.
Okay.
I'm not too good at multitasking. And as I'd mentioned earlier, you know, one of the biggest ones is violence against Indigenous women. We're the life bearers. We bring life into our communities. Our women were always honored as being sacred through our stories. And, you know, it's devastating when you look at the numbers, the statistics of the women who are physically assaulted, who are victims of domestic violence. You know, 64%. And yet that's really a low number. When we were in Alaska, it's 100% in most of the villages. In a lot of our reservations, it's 100%. So that's actually a really low number. And we always have to remember that violence against Indian women is rooted in colonization. Our women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than the national average. And 75% of Indian women murdered were killed by an intimate partner. And that, you know, that death by an intimate partner is the third leading cause of death for Indian women. It's third behind cancer and what's the other? Heart disease. It's the third leading cause of death for our women. And Indian women live our lives in the dangerous intersection of gender and race or ethnicity. This figure down here is also kind of low. It says 38%, and this is from an NIJ study that was done, that 38% of American Indian Alaska Native women victims of domestic violence were unable to receive necessary services. They just weren't available in most cases. And we know when we think of the 574 federally recognized tribes that we have, there are fewer than 50 tribal domestic violence shelters, with many states that don't even have any, like Oregon. There's none in Oregon. I think there's one in Nevada. I mean, just very, very few. So they have very few resources to respond to this tremendous amount of violence that we see happening in our communities against our women. And then again, this is, you can see it kind of parallels the trauma, historical trauma, the social context of violence against Indian women. Again, you have the poverty, homelessness, substance abuse, physical and mental illness, criminal justice system involvement, suicides, and child removal. This is a quote from Sarah Deer that I really like it around trafficking. It says that if you're a trafficker looking for the perfect population of people to violate, Native women would be a prime target. You have poverty, you have a people who have been traumatized, and you have a legal system that doesn't step in to stop it. And we know that there's many, many challenges and barriers to safety for our people because of this complex jurisdictional maze that we all live and operate in, and the lack of resources that we have to change this picture. And also just awareness of everything that's going on by people in the community. So what is trauma informed? Trauma informed is taking all forms of trauma into consideration. And I kind of come at this training from the domestic violence advocate perspective, because that was how it came to me. But I know that trauma informed is being used in a lot of different other fields and professions, such as law enforcement and the courts and child welfare and social services and healthcare, behavioral health. A lot of people are coming to incorporate trauma informed into their work. So, but when I'm talking about it, I guess it's around violence against women. So trauma informed is just good advocacy, because you're aware of what's going on with that other person. You're instinctively aware of what's going on, what's happening, the family they come from, you know, who they're married to. You know, you kind of have that sense of that when you're working with people in community. And trauma informed is understanding, you know, like I just mentioned, it's, you know, how trauma is affecting our feelings about ourselves, other people, the world, and our responses to those feelings. Are those good responses? Are they angry? Are we, you know, how are we handling those responses to those feelings that we're having? Being trauma informed is developing our capacity to manage our responses in ways that aren't at the expense of other people, ourselves, or our organizations. And so the more we learn how to handle that, understand it, and express it, we find ourselves in much better positions within our families, our communities, and the organizations that we work for. And oftentimes, you know, we need to find organizational and funding supports to help us make this happen. And there are a lot of resources that are out there that are available. And I sent quite a few to Lucinda, which I'm not sure if you shared that out. If not, please feel free to. There was healthcare curriculum. There was a number of things in there. There's also a resource that's a checklist for your organization on how trauma informed is your organization. And it kind of looks at simple things like how are people greeted when they walk in the door? You know, what do they have to do to even get in that door? So it just asks a lot of questions, and how you do your work, and how doing it through a trauma lens, you know, helps you do that work, become a more trusted entity in the community. When you're being trauma informed is really being treating people with dignity and respect. You know, treating people how you would like to be treated. And so we did a lot of work around this with domestic violence programs and organizations, because we found some of them had become very institutional. You know, like the minute you walk in the door, you had to fill out a 32-page intake form. And this is after you were beat up and had to stay up all night, and, you know, you find a way to get in to get some help, and right away you got to tell your story. And, you know, that's not being trauma informed. I mean, that's not even being considerate or being a good relative to anyone. It's, you know, it has you thinking about those ways of how you do things. Even what pictures are on your walls, what rules does your organization have, and all of those things. So it's just a kind of a self-examination at how you do things, how your organization does things. So with the trauma framework, what I really like about the trauma framework is that it normalizes our human responses to trauma. And sometimes that even includes people using substances, because that's coping. That's a coping mechanism for them. And it's being able to talk openly with them about that, non-judgmental. I'm glad you I'm glad you found a way to deal with this, but as we work together, let's see if we can find other healthier ways, to address your feelings and to help you deal with the trauma that you're experiencing. So, it normalizes that human response, and which is so important. I mean, you've heard people say, I've said it, we've probably all said it, I think something's wrong with me. And, it's like, well, this trauma really helps you understand that once you start questioning that. And so then it's kind of a shift in how we describe that. The injury model was what happened versus what's wrong. And so when you ask someone what's wrong with you, then all of a sudden you're starting off negatively, right? Because there's already the assumption something's wrong with this person. But if you ask this person, what happened to you? Tell me what happened. That's a very different question. It doesn't look like, oh no, did I do something wrong? It looks like they want to know what happened, why I'm here. So anyway, it's a shift in how we conceptualize all of that. And then once you make that shift, then you start seeing all the other things kind of fall into place. Adaptations when usual coping mechanisms are overwhelmed. And so we start looking at those symptoms that they have, that their responses to trauma, and start talking about them, and then start talking about other ways, to help with that. Trauma, the other thing is that it never really goes away. I remember, and I'm old, but I remember I was at this training on bullying, and God, I was probably bullied 40 years ago or something. I hadn't even really thought about it. It was totally out of my mind. And I started crying. I could not quit crying. I had to go in the bathroom and just cry for a while. And same with my story. When I tell my story, I could tell my story 100 times. And most of the time I'm cool, I can do it. But there's going to be one time when I start to talk and all of a sudden it hits me and I'm going to cry. And it's helpful for people to understand that's normal. That makes sense. That's how it should be, rather than feeling bad about these things, that you can accept them, and then you can accept who you are more fully. So it incorporates biological, emotional, cognitive, spiritual, and interpersonal domains. And so when we look at all of that, have you ever been so upset you can't eat, or so upset you can't work, you can't think, all of those things are impacted by trauma. And so I used to be, when I'd get really upset, I'd lose weight, and then sometimes I'd get really upset, I'd gain weight. So I just feel the impacts all the time on everything that I was going through. Then the work that we do in domestic violence is really we call it we don't call it a field, we call it a movement. We're a movement to end violence. And the work that we do is very strength-based and empowering. And again, which is why we don't use words like "what's wrong with you," again, not imply it's a strength-based approach. You did nothing wrong. You do not deserve to be beaten. You do not deserve to be hit. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be cared for. You deserve to be supported. And so looking at it that way is very different than looking at it the other way, like there's deficits, looking at drinking as a problem when in the trauma thing, we're looking at it as a response to trauma. So it's different ways of looking at things. And I know there's exceptions to everything. And I have some exceptions even in my family. So we all have exceptions to those things. And I always tell people, don't change everything you're doing by those exceptions. You know, that leave that out there. Just continue to do the strength-based supportive work that you know works. May not work on everyone, but it works on the vast majority of people because it makes them feel good about themselves. So again, it's important to understand the impact of trauma because it affects our capacity to trust other people. It's hard to reach out for help. I mean, so many times I ran a domestic violence program here in Albuquerque for a number of years. And so many times we got people, we were the last resort. And in fact, we kind of joked that was our name, the last resort, because people would just come just as they were about to lose everything. And of course, it made it harder to work with them. But at the same time, at least they came in, and at least we were there to work with them, to help them. But it's hard to reach out for help, to ask for help. And we see that a lot now with a lot of the housing insecurity and homelessness. We've got a neighbor that's looks like, I think he's losing his house. You know, their inability to reach out and ask for help. There's so much shame and things that you feel about yourself that it's hard to reach out and ask someone to help, to invite someone into your life, share what's going on and get the help that you need. We can't even trust ourselves. And I mentioned that earlier, you know, sometimes we don't experience ourselves as being deserving or worthwhile. It impacts our ability to solve problems, to exercise good judgment, to process information. I mean, we can give people, we can talk with people, meet with people, and give them some ideas of what they can do to take care of the situation that they're in, but their ability to process just, and so then we have a lot of programs saying, well, they're non-compliant. Well, they're not really non-compliant. They have a difficult time processing that information. And then it impacts their ability to take initiative and to thoughtfully plan. So you can see the big impact. I know when you think about people that you've worked with, you can see a lot of these situations. And then in terms of managing our internal states, you know, it's difficult to stay present and connected. Your mind's wandering somewhere else. You're thinking about someone else. And when you're trying to hold down a job and do the things that you need to do, it gets in the way. It gets in the way of what we're doing. Trauma gets in the way of how we live our lives. So some of the fundamental principles of trauma-informed approaches are safety, of course, is number one. You have to feel safe. Reliability and transparency, being very open, and it's not, and even if there's you know, people aren't always upfront with what's going on, like they might omit something that happened because they don't want to be judged by it. But when you're working from a trauma perspective, a trauma-informed approach, you're able to understand that better, and it doesn't go any further than that. Support, people need so much support. I mean, just kind words sometimes are all people need, or it's, you know, just a little boost. We all get by with a little boost, and collaboration and mutuality. You know, that there's a mutual respect for one another in the work that you're doing. That we're again treating people with dignity and respect. Through that, there's also, you know, a lot of education and awareness that takes place. And as a result of that, it can be very empowering, and it gives people their voice back to speak up for themselves, to speak up for their families, for their children, for their community, and to know that they have choices. You know, there's choices that can be made. And then, of course, it takes into consideration cultural, historical, and gender issues as well. then I think all of those, from a traditional indigenous perspective, wasn't as complicated back then as it is today in so many of our communities, because of the various influences that we've had since contact. There's been a lot of a lot of culture and traditions. Our traditions are all about change. Our traditions have always changed, and so COVID, I think, changed a lot of culture and traditions that we have in our country. So that's very much a part of who we are. So this slide really has to do with advocacy, doing the domestic violence advocacy, and it just again talks about a lot of things I'd already mentioned, that it really it helps our survivors understand their responses to the trauma that they've experienced. And it helps us to respond in ways that are more helpful and empathic. If we understand what they're going through, we get where they're coming from. And we're able to offer more suggestions or options for them, more ideas to think about, more creative things to think about, such as mindfulness or yoga, or, there's so many things out there that people can do, mudras, there's so many things that people can incorporate. And of course, our culture and traditions are to me, some of the best options and strategies out there. And it helps us to understand our own responses and their potential impact and need for organizational support. And again, this is a slide that was for domestic violence advocates working within organizations. But when you think about it in terms of your own organizational work with the DR, the work that you all are doing and the respective work that you all are doing in your communities, let's take a little break now, and maybe we can go to the chat, or if anybody wants to ask a question, or if you just would like to share in about your understanding of trauma.
If you would like to share, go ahead and raise your hand. Cool. Okay, Dale, you have the floor.
I have a question. I'm getting so much out of this dialogue, and I'm like furiously copying all of the notes to try to incorporate this into some training that we'll do for all the folks in the educational learning environment that I work in, because some individuals take to this concept really, really well, and they understand it and they roll with it. And others, there was a concept that you talked about, internalized oppression. And I think that's something that we're experiencing, of folks that have they have that sort of punitive concept of behavior correction really deeply ingrained in them. And they're not able to embrace seeing that there's a reason why for at least from my perspective in a school environment, why our students behave a certain way, why our parents behave a certain way, why the grandparents behave a certain way, and to be able to see that through a certain lens of being able to understand that trauma impacts their behavior, and that how we choose to respond to that has a really big impact on how that relationship develops. What would you suggest folks in this situation who are trying to take these concepts and provide training to any entity that provides services to the community here? How do you deal with that internalized oppression and that resistance to a more holistic approach to supporting families?
Yeah, it really takes one person it's really going at it one person at a time. And I know from a prime example that I have is when we had early on in the movement to end violence against women, they did not talk about mental health or substance use. And I remember the program that I ran, the majority of the women that came in either had either had the substance issue or their partner did, or it was there somewhere in that relationship. And so when we would talk to women about, you don't deserve to be hit. And it was always like, oh no, I was drinking. It doesn't matter if you were drinking, you don't deserve to be hit. No, it was my fault. I caused, there was so much self-blame, which again is part of that whole internalized oppression. It's not, blaming yourself and, not feeling good about yourself, not feeling that you're worthy enough to stand up for who you are. But what it really took was going at that for quite some time with people, not giving up. But staying with it. And there, again, as you had mentioned, there are people that are going to grasp it right away and love it and go with it. And there's people that it's going to take a little bit longer to do that. So I would encourage you just to keep at it. There's different ways that you can approach it. A lot of our culture and tradition deals with that. There's also, again, I had mentioned mindfulness. There's a lot of things that people can do. There's a lot of indigenous curriculum out there now around that, like the Gathering of Nations curriculum, which are community wellness, where it's really understanding that. And, people, people are in a lot of pain. And as a result of that, we see a lot of acting out in our communities, reacting out from that pain and the lack of self-love that they have for themselves. So it takes time, and it takes consistency, and it takes a lot of work to keep doing that, to keep pushing that. I know it's hard sometimes because there are some situations where it feels like this isn't going to work, but I haven't seen one yet where it hasn't worked, but it did feel like that at some point when we do this work. And it seems so simple that it's really complicated too. So I don't know if that helped or not, but thank you for the question. Is there another question?
In the chat, we have a comment from Gina L. She said, I would suggest reading White Benevolence, Racism, and Colonial Violence in the Helping Professions by Amanda Gebhard, Sheila McLean, and Verna St. Dennis. We're reading it in a community reading club among a diverse group. It's been really informative and is only a starting point. Thank you, Jean.
That's great. Yeah, that's excellent. There's so many books and resources out now on this too, which I think is really helpful. I remember when we first started talking about it years ago, it was there wasn't a whole lot then. That was probably, I don't know, I think the whole trauma work started coming into play maybe 20 years now. So it's taken a while to get here, but there's so much information there out on it now. There's all types of webinars and conferences that are devoted to trauma, understanding trauma, and there's a lot of books out there that have been written now about it. So I think it's really great. I mean, there's Olga Trujillo wrote one about her experience growing up trafficked since the time she was a little girl, understanding the trauma and the mental health impacts, and her coping and survival strategies throughout that. So there's a lot of good materials out there now. So it's really important to keep that up. Is there another question?
Hi, this is Randy Joan.
Yes.
I have my hand up, but I guess Zoe didn't see it.
It's hard to see.
I think it blends in with your little poster, the color-coded poster on the side. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to make this rule as brief. Like you said, I think the first time I heard about the trauma-informed care was through a Northern Navajo Medical Center presentation. They were doing a roundtable cafe type gathering a few years back. And then I heard about it, but And then I remember an experience that kind of brought it all home for me to fully kind of understanding it was the time when I took a trip to Bosque Redondo, the concentration camp where the Navajos were incarcerated in the late 1800s. I went to Fort Sumner, and then we looked at just structures of buildings where the Navajos were held and everything. And then I saw a pile of rocks that where people are putting, I guess, making offerings in that area. I saw that, and I'm walking, and then I walked into the museum. I grew up watching John Wayne movies. You know, I'm old enough to say that. With John Wayne movies and the cowboys and Indians, the cavalry, and then sometimes you did admire the cavalry, the army, and all this stuff, and so forth. I grew up in that environment, and I also seen in school about history, about the Long Walk and everything. But when I walked into the museum, and then I was kind of looking at things, and I turned and I saw this mannequin of a cavalry standing, a soldier standing there, and he had the blue coat and had the hat on top of it. And the emotions and the reaction that I received, and just sort of like the same thing that you were described as experiencing, the emotional experience you had, all that just came into me, and all this stuff. And then, and I didn't understand that. And I didn't know where that came from. And it was just seeing that uniform, and then that what it represented and what it was, and it just really kind of got me emotionally distraught. I remember that, and I think, and then that's what you're talking about, and that's you can't really say, well, that happened a long time ago. That happened to those people, but it is still with us, whether you realize it or not. That's just what I wanted to say. Bring that out. There's a lot of things you can say, and I'm enjoying this presentation too. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
In the chat, we also have a comment from Ava Wilson. Consider looking at the cycle of socialization by Bobby Harrow that helps to visualize how trauma can be reinforced through how we get socialized. Thank you.
Okay. Looks like Dale has his hand up.
Oh, no, sorry. I forgot to put my hand back down.
Oh, okay. I just saw it pop up on my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you everyone for those questions. If you have anything too, just again, please just raise your hand or unmute yourself. There's just a few, there's just what, 50? So I think we can be intimate here. So what does it mean to incorporate a trauma-informed perspective? And again, a lot of the stuff keeps coming up over and over again, and it's really understanding how trauma affects our bodies, minds, and spirits, our feelings about ourselves, other people, and the world, and our responses to those feelings. It's about developing the knowledge, awareness, and skills to manage our responses in ways that aren't at the expense of our other people, ourselves, our organizations, or our communities. It's about transforming those experiences into healing, growth, and social change. And it's about creating the necessary organizational, community, and funding supports to sustain our work. And so thinking about all of this and thinking about our organizations, I think that the number one thing with being trauma informed is that it begins with you. It begins with me, looking into ourselves, who we are, what we're bringing. And trauma-informed services for programs, again, incorporates knowledge about trauma into all aspects of service delivery. Everything from the minute a person walks into the door, how staff interact with one another, how we treat one another. Tilly Black Bear, who is like one of the founders of the movement to end violence against women everywhere. Her thing is she talks about the only way we can end violence is to strengthen and support one another and treat one another as relatives, to be good relatives to one another. And she talks about how, in our communities, how we interact with one another, our judgment of other people, of other families and stuff like that, how it really that doesn't affect them, that affects us, that affects me, when I misjudge someone or I'm judgmental or that's on me. I'm only hurting myself with that. So thinking about that and thinking about how you want to be treated and how you will interact with other people all minimizes the traumatization, and it facilitates healing, connection, and empowerment. So again, this is kind of more to advocates. It helps us understand a wider range of experiences that people have. All we have is our experience. All we bring when we meet with someone is who we are. And so it's very important that we kind of check ourselves to see, where we stand with things. And again, I kind of use myself as an example, because I had a very low view of people who drank, because I had come from a family where we have quite a few alcoholics, and my brother was a heroin addict, and I just had zero tolerance for that stuff. And but when you're in a program and you're working with people who are dealing with substance use and domestic violence, you gotta change some thinking there. And so I went to Al-Anon, which was one of the best things I think I ever did. Really helped me understand so many things. That's another great resource for people. There's also mental health, first aid. There's a lot of resources out there that really help you understand these things a little bit more. And just understanding how with all good intention, how you said something that really was hurtful to someone, and not even realizing it because you're not aware. You're not aware of mental health issues. Like saying to someone who's depressed, well, you need to exercise more. You need to get out of your rut. Well, that's easier said than done, and that advice does absolutely nothing for anybody. So again, understanding a lot of this, which is what I think the whole trauma framework does, is really helps us get more in touch with ourselves as we do this work. And then we pass that on to the people that we work with. So we have, I think a lot of this I'd already mentioned about advocates working with victim survivors. The empathy, the self-reflection, and paying attention to our own responses and needs is really important here. And there's a lot of tools out there, and I did send some to Lucinda. And again, if anybody wants any of that, I'm happy to provide any of that, along with a copy of the PowerPoint if you want that. So how does this help survivors? Again, just normalizing and making sense of responses. So often we would have people that would come in and they thought they were the only person in the world that was dealing with this problem. And they thought they were all alone. And so a lot of times, in our work using that trauma lens, people don't feel alone. They feel like, oh my God, I'm not the only one. There's other people that are dealing with this, and how are they dealing with this? So then it also helps offer alternative coping strategies. And, it really acknowledges that importance, as well as the challenges of connection, just connecting with another person who's been really traumatized. And it also helps prepare for the trauma triggers, just knowing that this may happen again, just knowing that I could start crying if someone starts talking about bullying. Just knowing that could be a possibility really helps me be a little bit more in control of myself as well. Helps me understand all of that. It ensures choice. I have choices that I can make in these situations. And ultimately, I have that control over myself. And that's, bringing that to other people, letting them know they have control over themselves, rather than just feeling helpless or hopeless. Oh my God. I'm sorry about that. Everything's all set up on my computer. So, I don't know if that happened to this one. Oh. Experiencing the traumatic effects of abuse puts survivors at greater risk from abusive partners and from the systems they turn to for help. And I think we'll, I don't know, did my mouse die? Okay. I think it did. Okay. Sorry. Oh my God, my mouse died. Let me see if I can do it with this. Okay, good. So with this slide is that, people, when you understand the dynamics of domestic violence, and when you understand that in relationships, there's really a strong predatory nature to all of that. And oftentimes perpetrators of violence are predators that prey on people with vulnerabilities. And again, I'm generalizing, but this is a pattern. They prey on people with vulnerabilities, like they'll prey on people with mental health issues. They'll prey on people with disabilities. And as we look at the data and the information on that, we see that those are the highest, in people with disabilities have extremely high rates of domestic violence. And people with mental health issues experience high rates of domestic violence. So there's kind of a predatory nature to that. And that manifests its way in some very coercive tactics on the part of people that perpetrators, I guess, of the violence. They use a lot of those tactics to keep those people under their control. We know that domestic violence is about power and control. And that certainly plays out in these scenarios here. Oh yeah, my mouse is dead. So people who abuse their partners, they do it very coercively. They'll undermine their partner's sanity and sobriety. They'll control their partner's ability to engage in treatment, like not giving them access to transportation, or a way to get to meet with a counselor, or even a AA meeting or anything. And undermining their sanity and sobriety by telling their family and friends that this person's crazy, or they're an alcoholic, they're a drunk, they're not doing good, they need, but at the same time not getting, if that was true, not even making any effort to get them the help they need. They sabotage their partner's recovery efforts, like we've heard stories of withholding medication. And some of the medication is, it's medication you just can't stop abruptly. Discrediting their partners with potential sources of protection and support, and to jeopardize custody. And of course, one of the main reasons women, and I'm being gender specific here, one of the main reasons women stay in abusive relationships is they don't want to lose their kids. Women, or people enter into these, and I'm again gender specific, but they love their partner. The abuse didn't start the first night they went out with them. And we would ask women, if he hit you the first night you went out with him, would you have gone out with him again? And it's like, no, heck no. So it's a pattern that builds up over time. And and so when women do have, if it's, and rarely is it ever just domestic violence. There's child welfare, there's the legal system involvement, there's housing, There's mental health issues. There could be health issues. There could be behavioral health issues that, you know, it's never just domestic violence, very, very rarely. All these other things come into play. And I think that's the other really beauty of being trauma informed is seeing all those connections. You know, otherwise we're just looking at through a keyhole at a person. If we're not being trauma informed is a very holistic approach to working with people. And then they exploit their partner's substance use for personal or financial gain. And I knew that during the height of the opioid epidemic, we were hearing and seeing all these stories of partners breaking their arms and taking them to the emergency room so they could get their pain pills. You know, we heard so many stories like that. And of course, now that those have all gotten so hard to get. It's you know, it's probably gotten even more dangerous because they all come from the streets now. But anyway, that's we see these things happen in a lot of different ways. So again, I think the stuff I just covered about, we see high rates of substance use among women who've been victimized. And a lot of times it's self-medicating. It's a coping strategy. Other times there's women that were, we used to hear stories of women being forced to drink with them. They didn't want to drink, but they were being forced to drink and go out on payday or whatever. And of course, they knew that it was going to get violent before the night was over. And so it was just kind of one of those things. High rates of victimization among women in mental health and substance use treatment. Again, maybe coerced into using or dealing, or you know, and then we know that in trafficking, that coercion plays a huge role, getting their partners addicted, getting them hooked on drugs. So the protective factors, of course, are, you know, resilience, which is the capacity for successful adaptation despite challenging and threatening circumstances. And I know this was always described to me early on as being like tall grass in the wind, and how you kind of blow from side to side, but you're still standing. Thinking about resilience that way, that yeah, we're hit by these things, but we're still standing tall, and we're still standing strong. Promoting protective factors is promoting resilience in those at risk. And these include responsive caregivers and other caring adults. You know, secure attachment is so important. Social support, social fabric, community, spirituality, religion. You know, all of these things can be very strong protective factors. Our traditions, our cultural identity, family and community, our sense of belonging. A lot of work that a lot of programs are doing around trafficking is because so many people feel like they don't belong. Their families may have moved to the city when they were kids. They grew up in the city, may not have a strong cultural connection to home. And from what I've heard from a lot of the youth, when they've tried to go home, they didn't feel accepted there either. And so a lot of the work that they're doing in the cities is they're creating that belonging and that connection. They're having naming ceremonies. They're doing a lot of our ceremonies to create that sense of belonging. And it's really successful. And it really helps people stay out of that, or be, you know, their ability to stay out of that. So that's really important. And I think those things are really significant when we talk about missing and murdered. Individual factors such as capacities and talents, you know, ability to positively engage others. There's so many things that you can do in the community too that kind of addresses the trauma, the things that kind of boost that sense of belonging and togetherness. Certainly our ceremonies do that, but there's things that we can do in our communities to do that. The marches, I think, the rallies, the things that you all have been engaged in doing have been significant in bringing communities together. That's what I really, that's a really great aspect of all the work that you're doing. And so there's, food, bringing people together, foods, income, there's so much work around food sovereignty now. And of course, that housing it will continue to be an issue. And also always looking at safety and resources. So we always look at how do we see our work? And I think another way is what lens are we looking through when we do our work? And sometimes we're wearing multiple lenses. So without a trauma lens, our services can be re-traumatizing. And we may not even know that. But the beauty of it is once you know it, you know it. And so a lot of change happens in becoming trauma informed. Without a DV lens, services can be endangering. We may not, if we don't understand the dynamics of domestic violence or violence in relationships or sexual assault or trafficking, if we don't understand those, our services could be very endangering and put people at risk. Without a cultural lens, our services may not be relevant or helpful. It may just be, passing the buck, giving them a phone here, call that number, go see these guys. We're not being a good relative to this person who's come in, who needs us. And without a human rights lens, our services may not be accessible. Human rights lens is also a very uplifting, honorable lens to look through, and that's a lens we look through when we do our housing work. So this is a right. This isn't something that this isn't an entitlement. It's not conditional. Every person has a right to safe, affordable housing. Understanding and responding appropriately can counter these effects. And so it's really important. Again, I know I must have said it 100 times about building up our own knowledge base around trauma and its impact. So anyway, these are just some questions. How do we meet survivors where they are? How do we embody in our own work and organizations the world we want to create? How do we work together across disciplines and systems? How do we respond to the complex range of issues survivors face? And maybe we can stop here too for some questions or comments. And Lucinda, you can let me know.
Okay.
I lost my mouse.
So far, I've asked everyone to list their email address so I can send that information that you've shared with me to them after the chat.
Okay.
So I have, I don't have any questions so far.
Oh, okay.
If you can raise your hand, I can look out for your profile and see. Nothing so far. And if you want to take your microphone off mute, you can do so too.
Okay. Well, we can move on. We just have a couple more minutes. Let's see.
Yeah, so far I don't see any questions, just mainly their email addresses, which I'm documenting right now.
Oh, okay, good. Great. So being trauma informed counteracts the experience of abuse, as I think we've gone through that part. It counteracts the effects of abuse. It recognizes the impact on staff and organizations. There's so many levels and ways that you can take this out. And I always like to think of being trauma informed as kind of that drop in a puddle of water, and how it ripples out. And that drop in the water is really you or me, as thinking about that as ourselves. And then once we become trauma informed, how that ripples out into our families, our communities, our organizations. And so again, and just summing it up, it means asking a different question, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Again, this is kind of summing it up. It strengthens our roles as advocates. It's just good advocacy. And I used to call it old school advocacy, which kind of meant treating people with dignity and respect, validating their experience, being non-judgmental, supporting their decisions, respecting their autonomy, in terms of how we worked with people. And so it's really just good advocacy. It's empowering. It's holistic because it looks at everything. It looks at all the connections. It brings that all in, and it promotes healing. So being trauma informed means embodying in our own practices and institutions the world we want to create. So it's very much about social change and about our strength-based work going forward. And as I'd mentioned earlier, it all begins with me. We all have our biases, every single one of us. And so it calls us to examine our own biases, thoughts, and actions, and how what we think and feel affects our work. Yes, and there's so many adages, I think, that I know we've all been aware of over the years, about how we can't possibly help someone else if we haven't helped ourselves, or we can't give someone love if we don't love ourselves. We've heard all these things. It's on us. We have to take care of ourselves first. And then thinking about our interactions, when we meet people, we're that tip of the iceberg. We're two tips of an iceberg meeting each other. And we are what we see on top, but we don't always see what's beneath. So what's going on, on below the surface? What's going on below the surface for me? And what's going on below the surface for you? We're bringing all of that together in our interactions with one another. So trauma is a part of the circle of life. And I found this saying, and I really like it because it says every woman who heals herself heals the women who came before her and those who will come after her. And I think that's really, to me, the beauty of doing this work and incorporating this work and framework into what we do, is that it creates that change. It changes the past, it changes the present, and it changes the future. And so I just think that's really beautiful. And again, just some other things to think about when we think about trauma, that trauma is like a roadblock or burden in our path. And healing is the way to make the roadblock or burden more manageable, or to make it go away completely.
I have a comment from Randy.
Sure.
I will use information in talking to people when we present our Navajo wellness model. We talk about it, but for me, it will be with more emphasis. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you, Andy. So healing from trauma involves restoring safety, feeling safe. And that's a really good feeling. If you haven't had it in a long time and then you have it, it takes a while. It's like, I'm safe. You're still gonna kind of look over your shoulder. But it eases and it eventually goes away. Restoring our connections to people. A lot of those bridges get compromised when we're dealing with not only our stuff, but other people's stuff too. It restores our capacities, trust, meaning, and hope. And it's meeting survivors where they are, meeting people where they are, empowering and providing education and information, identifying strengths and honoring resilience, strengthening emotional and interpersonal skill building, and promoting culture, community, and spirituality. Indian cultures reflect a tradition of respect, honor, and compassion towards all living things, especially women and children. And Indian women and children are the future and the heartbeat of Indian communities. And so it's really important that, so many of us engage in that provision of woman-centered, woman-focused work. And again, I don't mean to be gender specific here, but that's a lot of this is that approach. Creating and enforcing laws to protect women from violence creates peace in our communities. And I don't know if I'll get into this. Let's see, we're coming up on time. But just to do, I can send you the Three Sisters story. But these are some of the things that emerged from the movement to end violence against women everywhere. And that's the important role of advocacy, engaging our communities, challenging systems, ensuring safety and confidentiality, asking for accountability across all systems, and to be trauma-informed and survivor-centered. Those are the aspects or cornerstones of our movement. And again, this was the old school advocacy I talked about, treating women with dignity and respect, or one another with dignity and respect, believing a person's story, validating their experience, not judging, informing and educating, supporting, and having a knowledge of our communities and our resources. And this is kind of interesting that, that the loss of culture was the beginning of our trauma. And culture is one of the best ways to break out of the cycle of trauma. So you can see how and that kind of speaks to the duality too of our customs and our traditions of how we look at things as neither good nor bad, but they have aspects of both. And here we have culture, the loss of it being the beginning of our trauma, and yet that being the strength that can break us out of that. A lot of times with our program that we ran, when women came in, we didn't have anything. We offered them something to drink or to eat. We'd offer sage or sweet grass. A lot of times, it was our goal to model traditional behavior, to promote cross-cultural awareness. We dealt with people from different tribes, different nations, different cultures. And, we wanted to be respectful of all of that, to have the opportunity to share practices that are unique to each tribe, having access to traditional healing, sacred medicines and ceremonies. And one of our sacred ceremonies is that of making relatives. And so it wasn't unusual for the kids to come in and call us auntie or grandma, or the kids got that right away. And then it was a while when we all started calling each other sister or sister friend. So yeah, it's those things are so critical. So some of the concepts of traditional healing are that healing means that the circle is whole again. And I know you've heard it described a lot, that the circle is broken by contact and everything that's happened with so many of our people. But when we begin the healing, then that circle becomes whole again. And one must know how to change one's thinking, feelings, and beliefs about a traumatic experience in order to regain balance or harmony. And I really like that one, because it's, we can't change the past, but we can change how we think about it. And I think that's so important, and to think about it that way too. And we may have gone our whole lives thinking that, my dad was a horrible person, but if we can change how we think, if I can change how I think about my dad, I'm changing a whole lot of things. And I think I'll probably conclude with this one. It's a proverb I always like to end with, and it's, if the emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of a woman is intact, so too is that of her family, community, and society. And so I think I'll just end with that one. And if there are any questions, or I know you have a poll and some other things to do, right, Lucinda?
Yes, there is a post question there, if everyone can stick around. and answer those for us. It's part of the evaluation process that I'd like to help out with the MMDR program. So if you could stick around and answer the questions for us, I would really appreciate that. And I have one comment from CDVAP, Polyup. Once I heard you can only heal Indigenous wounds and Indigenous trauma with Indigenous healing and Indigenous medicine. Consider the accumulation of ceremony as the antidote to accumulation of trauma. Thank you, Gwen. Beautiful presentation. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? You can take
For,
your, go ahead.
For the post test, I'm going to put a question in the chat. Okay, and the question is, I'll read it to you as I put it in there. Give one example of how trauma-informed care can help victims and their families. And you can just answer that in the chat. We'll give you a few minutes to answer that.
I have one raised hand. Dr. Angelo, can you take your mic off mute?
Yes, good morning. I'm tuning in from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm actually from Steamboat, Arizona on the Navajo Nation. So I'm really proud of this organization and how you're presenting this type of material to direct service providers. So I want to thank the organization and the presenter for this. I just want to share that I'm a clinical director in a large community mental health organization. And I feel like it's important to say that being trauma informed also means that we're working within our scope of practice, to not do harm. And then the other thing too is, the changing the way we see healing trauma. I think it's important for us to understand that there are changes happening, and I think they're positive. So to be trauma informed would include, being respectful of the people that you're working with, and not having them to rehash the trauma so we don't do harm. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a raised hand for Heavenly Kim. If you could take your mic off mute.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a comment because I work at a Indigenous organization. However, I am not Indigenous. And so I think it's important for those of us who are non-Indigenous but working with people who are Indigenous to remember, like Miss Gwendolyn spoke about, that we inform ourselves and remember the historical trauma when we're working with people, that we're not blaming the person, but that we keep in mind all of the historical and generational trauma that comes with the Indigenous communities. And so being sensitive to that, I think is really important. I think this training is really important for those of us who are not, who are non-Indigenous, but who are working in Indigenous communities. I think this is very important for those of us to sit in on these trainings and to learn these things so that we can be, like the person who spoke before me, not bring up more trauma and more harm to the communities that we're working with. So I'm very grateful that I was able to sit in on this training. I'm thankful that I could be here. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to say that there's actually some comments here. Should we go through the comments? Okay. Let's start with Jenny Johnson. Create empathy and understanding. Jacob says it helps victims feel safe and give them more opportunities to succeed. I also agree. Sherry says also allows families to ask for support instead of isolating the problem. Very good. Carmeletta states creates a reconnection to their soul and brings healing for generations. Dale enters inclusively trauma-informed care can ensure that all individuals receive the support they need regardless of the current level of functioning. Very good. Marcy states trauma-informed care makes positive connections for individuals and service provided. Strengthening, I can't really read the name, says create more trust between one another. CDV AP Polia states trauma-informed care allows one to forgive ourselves and our responses to trauma, which can be healed rather than weakness or problems that can be fixed. That has to be fixed. Debbie states allows empathy and forgiveness when creating positive community. Aba states preventing further trauma being passed down and promote healing instead. Gina posts here, anytime we have to stop reloading trauma by believing a survivor the first time we recount information, the more it gives more room for survivor to be able to give more information to the family or families about what they need from them. I've noticed that the more survivors are able to put down some of their worries, they can talk easier to support systems. Lots of times you can feel the stress between survivor and their family because their systems keep questioning the survivor's account. By believing them the first time, it alleviates the stress survivor is feeling from their family, who might be hearing the responders continue in the question's story or experience. Believing survivors is the best trauma-informed response we can have, especially our system partners. Jane enters, make them feel safe, listen well, and acknowledge what they're feeling. Dolores states stopping continued stigmatism. Nicole states it normalizes trauma and makes sense of the responses. By understanding the wider range of experience, advocates are able to provide better resources and allow room for transparency with victims and their family. And then from Renee McDonald, reactions such as addictions, abuse, non-acceptance of help are symptoms of trauma, not the root cause, and they do not have to share their story and be able to receive help. I think this is all really good information. I really appreciate all of your comments. Was there another question or poll question?
No, I think that'll be
That
it.
was it.
Yeah, we have a hand up from Jolene.
Okay, go ahead, Jody, take your mic off mute.
Yeah, good morning. And thank you so much, Gwen, for providing this amazing presentation. So good to see you and hear you and to be in the same space with you. It's always an honor. I would also say that all of the things that I think I have learned in terms of trauma-informed care were through the tools of NIWRC. And something I actually did learn from NIWRC, and I believe this might have been a co-presentation between Gwen and Brenda Hill, about even the language we're using in the work that we are engaged in. So aside from direct interactions with survivors of violence or families who are going through the crisis of a missing or murdered relative, is how we talk, is how we create that space of empowerment for families and for survivors, even trying not to use the word victim. That can have some connotations on its own, and definitely understand that, you know, in official processes, that's the language they use. But if we're talking in these spaces and we're talking about humanizing and giving dignity to those relatives who are most in need and vulnerable, it's also about how we shift our language from not using a victim and saying survivor, because they are surviving. They are going through the motions through this each day, and we have to commend their strengths. We have to dignify the strengths that they're engaged in to take care of themselves, to take care of their families, to take care of their children, and trying to keep all of those things going and building upon those strengths and humanizing the language and how we talk with our relatives. And I think something that I also learned, we had a training about setting boundaries last week. Trauma-informed care also means healthy boundaries for yourself as advocates, or for folks in community who are working directly with relatives. And the number one rule of advocacy is we are here to help relatives in need and survivors become their own advocates. And so changing how we're having those conversations with them, how we're utilizing trauma-informed language as well, is really important, in addition to those direct interactions that we have with survivors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. I have Randy, you have your hand up. Go ahead and take your mic off mute.
Hello again, Yat Ehnana. I just wanted to, the best way to express ideas and so forth is probably through stories and through humor. Don't worry, it's not a long story. And the thing, it's a humor, it's a joke in Navajo. I guess this young person went off to school, and he used to do all the things that happen on Navajo, herding sheep and all the activities that he did. He kind of has that knowledge, but he went to school and he was away for many years. And he even went to college, and he came back from school, and people were kind of timid that he came back. And then they were saying like, he went to all these schools, and he's very educated now, and he really learned the white people really taught him how to think, and he has all these all these degrees. He has those. So people were timid, not talking to him, and then they weren't really talking. There was really no more communication because they thought he might have didn't speak Navajo anymore. So he's sitting in the outside, and then people were eating breakfast, and they were sitting outside, and then all of a sudden he jumps up and he says, the Bechen J, meaning that he jumped up and he said that, and people were shocked, and they heard him yell in Navajo saying, look, the sheep are busting out of the corral. And then that happened. So a lot of time, I guess it's safe for me to tell this joke because I'm educated too. I went to college, Anyway, so the thing is that I think trauma-informed care to me is that it's reminding us and the service providers, the doctors and all those people, kind of refocusing and approaching providing service from a different perspective. And that's why I really like the Navajo wellness model that we're doing here, that we picked up in our service unit. It was developed by practitioners, and then also by medical doctors at Indian Health Service, and then it's being taught given to people in the service that provide service to talk to people. So I think that's what I really like about this trauma-informed care. And then I think we just need to do more of being able to giving us a different perspective and providing care for our people. So again, thank you very much. I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, Randy. I had Jenny that had her hand up. I'm sorry about that. Do you want to take your mic off mute?
Hi, my name is Jenny Johnson. I'm currently a social worker here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I actually am a trauma and bereavement therapist, an EMDR therapist, and working with individuals in the urban setting. I want to honor the fact that for me, being a trauma and care provider is managing my own responses to trauma. You know, growing up in various situations that some of my clients and patients are sharing, I think for me is the constant awareness that I too am always healing each and every day, being a person. For me, I've really humbled myself to providing a space of grief for individuals, because as a Navajo woman, there are particular teachings that I was taught about grief from my family, but also what I've seen from the pandemic is how do we normalize the fact that grief is very much a part of our communities and families now. So my son-in-law's father was a Hatafli from back home, and unfortunately, he lost his breath of life to COVID. And for me, inside that family with their traditional beliefs is that you don't grieve, but those children are grieving. And so I had a conversation with the family of normalizing grief, with the understanding that these children are saying, where's my grandfather? When is he coming back? And also helping them as a person, as a human being first, to know that grief is a natural part of being a human being. And so my perspective is I was working with a practitioner. I'm also a cultural provider here in the city. And we're talking about iya. It's this concept that, my Nolly always say, iya, watch out, But I want to share that the teaching I heard from one of my mentors was nilya. Nilya means look at it. It means there's something to be taught from this experience, from these losses. And from that perspective, I work with human beings to normalize grief, because trauma-informed care is really, truly, for me, I focus on intergenerational healing. But in order to do that, I need to be comfortable sitting with them as they process their trauma. So one thing I learned as a person who talks about death a lot is this is one thing I'd like to share with each and every one of you as a grief therapist. When a person is processing their grief in my office, I make tissues available, but I never push them towards them, because one of my great mentors shared with me, it's an unconscious communication for them to clean it up. I don't want them to clean it up. I want them to process that. I let them know, though, that those tissues are there should they need them. Because what I see working with Indigenous people is processing trauma can be scary. Just the process of talking about it is very scary. So for myself, as a person who has immersed myself in my healing, I really work hard to sit still with myself and to be mindful, that I too am going to have a response to their healing, but I cannot get dysregulated. So just to end my expression, I'll just check in with myself. It's a check-in, and I'll be like, Jenny, that's not yours. That's not yours, honey. Like, it might look the same, but it's not yours. So just a skill for the practitioners, they don't know this, but I'll just touch myself and I'll remind myself that I'm here for me, because I too get dysregulated when I hear someone talking about domestic violence, because I'm human. I survived that. And to go from victim to survivor, I empower a warrior. I empower the inner warrior. So that's the language I choose from being a practitioner here at Native American Connection. So I want to just thank each and every one of you for the good way, the heart medicine that you're sharing. And as practitioners, I'm super proud of us being able to normalize grief, because COVID taught me a lot about learning how to sit still. And in closure, those of you who didn't get to pray in that time of COVID, I want to honor our home fireplaces, because I learned my home fireplace was always going. I was always using that cedar at home. And so I want to just wish you all continued blessings. It was a good reminder this morning, for your own health and wellness, and also for your professional goals. So thank you for being the frontline warriors. Thank you for this training opportunity. Thank you, Gwendolyn.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Everything that you said just really resonates to what we've been working on in the past year. I really appreciate everything that you've said. As a parent, especially for myself, I try not to bring on the same emotions to myself as a mother. When I have 4 kids at home, and they've done the whole homeschool routine, and a lot of their emotions, they think that they're trying to repress them. But when I ask them certain questions, I ask them, how does that make you feel? I know that you think that I might be upset, but I'm not. opening up and making sure that you have that opportunity to tell me and share that emotion with me, and nothing will be judged. And I think that will resonate with everyone, especially as Indigenous advocates for our people. It'll make, it'll make this process a lot more easier for all of us. So thank you so much for that, Jenny. Do we have any more, anybody else who wants to speak? I'm looking. So I